Enjoy railroad adventure videos of Colorado, Hawaii, Alaska, and other spectacular destinations. For a free catalog, call 1-800-345-6120.
Pike's Peak, America's most famous mountain. Lieutenant Zebulon Montgomery Pike first saw the peak on the afternoon of November 15, 1806. He was not the first to see it. He attempted to climb it, but did not reach the summit. Incredibly, railroad trains now carry sightseers to the summit of Pikes Peak, and have done so since June of 1891. In the 1930s, the Depression made the Cog Railroad's depot a quiet place. Although fancy touring cars seldom bring passengers anymore, that same depot still welcomes arriving passengers. There is an air of excitement as passengers arrive at this quaint 1891 building and purchase tickets for the ascent of America's most famous mountain. Waiting for the train is a little more relaxing with hummingbirds entertaining. Of course, passengers can explore the antique steam locomotive on display near the depot, or simply enjoy the flowers and anticipate the trip through Colorado's mountain peaks. There is a small building across the tracks from the depot. Years ago, other passengers once arrived here from Manitou Springs. That building is now the railroad's offices, but was once a trolley station with a unique feature. Ruxton Creek actually runs under it. You can see that same tunnel in the lower left. The building over the creek was the trolley station. The tracks of the Manitou Electric Railway and Casino Company in the foreground once brought passengers up from downtown Manitou Springs. Near the shops is the coal dock that once fed hungry steam engines. Passengers look up toward the shop as a few bells are heard, and their train starts down to the depot. The excitement returns as anticipation for the trip runs as high as the 14,110-foot mountain the train will climb. A word from the dispatcher, and our train is ready to leave. The Manitou and Pikes Peak is a cog railway. Our train can climb 25 feet for each 100 feet it moves forward. An ordinary railroad train has difficulty climbing 4 feet in that same distance. The cog system used by our railroad is called an Abtrack, named after Swiss engineer Roman Abt, who invented it. The offset teeth cut into a center rack rail mesh with gears called cog wheels under our train, providing all the propulsion. The outer rails are just used to balance the train. Cog railway switches have many moving parts. Our train climbs through the Pike National Forest. With 1,400,000 acres, this forest is larger than the state of Delaware. It's the third largest in Colorado and includes many historical and recreational sites. The distance from the depot is marked on mileposts along the track. Our train arrives at Minnehaha, the location of a passing siding by which we will get by the first of 2 downhill trains we will encounter, as this is a busy railroad. Our conductor throws the switch that will allow the trains to pass. The passing sidings were not built until 1976. Sharp-eyed passengers spot Minnehaha Falls. Those same falls appear on this historic photo amid the few summer homes once built on the 35 lots here. Established by a Nebraska professor, the Alpine Laboratory once conducted research in high-altitude flora. Meanwhile, the downhill train has arrived, and we can again continue our journey to Pikes Peak. Today, it is hard to believe that cabins, a laboratory, and even a hotel, the Minnehaha House, once graced these hillsides. Today, a water tank that once quenched thirsty steam engines is all that remains. At Son of a Gun Hill, our train climbs at 25% grade. It was named by steam locomotive firemen who had to shovel a lot of coal to climb this hill. Next to Ruxton Creek are the remains of a small cabin. Years ago, hikers were allowed along the railroad, and this cabin's last use was as a refreshment stand. The spire on the right is Eagle's Roost, while on the left is Castle's Dome. Together, they form Hell Gate, the only natural gateway to the summit of Pikes Peak. Thomas Palsgrove, shown here with his wife Nettie and children Harry and Mary, built a one-room cabin at the head of Engelman Canyon in 1882. Intending to run cattle, Thomas also sold refreshments to weary hikers, and by 1884 had opened a hotel. The hotel became popular and was expanded to 15 rooms. The railroad and the siding it built contributed to the hotel's increasing popularity. A small station included a refreshment stand and post office. Closed in 1916, it was damaged by fire in 1922 and razed in 1926. A water tank remains to mark the spot. The ruins of two cabins mark the beginning of Ruxton Park, a former town site. Lots sold for $25 to $200. Still inhabited, it is home to caretakers for the Colorado Springs watershed lakes and the oldest hydroelectric plant west of the Mississippi. The town was developed by Thomas Palsgrove of the Halfway House. A settling basin was built in the early 1900s. Water from this basin travels to the hydroelectric plant across from the railroad shops in Manitou Springs. The caretaker's driveway is 60 miles long, discouraging quick trips to town. At mile 4, we can see the path of our tracks on the big hill, high on Sackett Mountain. Mountain View is the longest straight track on the railroad, 3/4 of a mile. An old railroad coach rests here as a shelter for track workers and hikers from the Bar Trail. The offices of the Pikes Peak Daily News stood at Old Mountain View, a little downhill of the present location. Passengers' names were gathered on the uphill train. By the time the train returned downhill, an edition of the paper with these names was ready to be sold. Steam locomotives once took water at Mountain View, and an operational water tank remains here. Each autumn, the bright green leaves of aspen trees change to brilliant shades of yellow and orange. A member of the poplar family, they are often called quaking aspen after the shimmering of their leaves.
quick look in the valley below us to the 16th side of the train, you'll see a large group of rocks. You are now looking upon the Lion's Den, and as I just mentioned, that was as high as Lieutenant Pike and his expedition made it.
At Grecian Bend, our train begins its climb up the track that will take us above Timberline, track called the Big Hill. Passengers always wonder about the train's steering wheel. The engineer uses it to control the train's speed and brakes. From the very beginning, track work was critical to the railroad's excellent safety record. Today's track crew carries on that grand tradition. It is difficult but essential work in searing sun and biting cold, performed at high altitudes. A typical day starts with loading ties onto a flat car. All the railroad's 52,000 ties and 8 3/4 miles of track rail must be regularly replaced for safe operation. Today, those ties are unloaded just below 12,000 feet. First, the bolts that hold the rack rail to the tie must be removed by unscrewing and then pulling them out. Next, the spikes holding the tie to the outside rails are removed. The worn tie is dug out, loosened, and removed to be discarded. Once the new tie has been inserted, it is forced up against the rails. Spikes fasten the outside rails to the tie. Finally, holes are drilled to fasten the rack rail to the tie, and bolts set in these holes are driven home. Day's end sees this seldom-seen crew heading home for a well-deserved rest. Lake Moraine is the first of 7 lakes that are part of the Colorado Springs watershed.
Officially cross over into the western slope of the mountain. Just before we do, I would like to point out the pyramid-shaped profile of Mount Oldmont right across the valley from us, the second highest mountain along the front range of the Rockies. It is also called the Calendar Mountain because of its height, 12,365 feet above sea level.
We will meet another train here at Windy Point. Years ago, to save the slow steam-driven trip to work, the section foreman, his family, and the section crew lived in this stone building while maintaining the track. the downhill train arrives, our train continues uphill. Extraordinary alpine views are everywhere as the breeze acquires the chill of altitude. This is Pike's Peak granite, broken into small pieces by the freezing of water that has seeped into the porous rock. Our conductor points out a small spot out there in the field. A pump house and reservoir supplied water to the tank at Windy Point. An employee carried coal from the track to fire the boiler that pumped the water. Along with room and board, he received $1 a day. The original Windy Point tank no longer exists. This was the highest water tank on the railroad, enabling the thirsty steam locomotives to reach the summit. The marmot, a small animal, is often seen by passengers above timberline, as are Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep. The saddle between Pikes Peak and Sackett Mountain features views of the mountains to the west and Colorado Springs to the east. Timbers, used to keep wagons from sinking into the mud on an old wagon road, remind us that there are other ways up. Dr. Edwin James was the first to climb the peak in 1820. Julia Holmes was the first woman to climb it in 1858. Hiking the railroad was popular but is no longer allowed. Fred Barr owned the Burro concession on Mount Manitou and built a new trail to the summit between 1914 and 1918. Years before, Zalman Simmons rode a burro to the summit and was convinced from his discomfort to build the Manitou and Pikes Peak Railway. Simmons also manufactured mattresses. Horses were used as well as burros. Huntley and Carlisle operated carriages to the summit from the Colorado Midland Railway Station in Cascade. This became the Pikes Peak Auto Highway in 1915, a toll road. At 14,110 feet, Pikes Peak is the 32nd highest in Colorado. It stands alone on the edge of the plains. Visible for miles, it became the symbol of the American West. We have arrived at the summit of America's most famous mountain. While some passengers head for the refreshments and shop of the Summit House, others pose for pictures, proving their adventure to relatives back home. Views of aspen-covered, lake-frilled valleys grace the south. Gold Hill and the mines of Cripple Creek appear to the west. The picturesque mountain town of Woodland Park and Rampart Reservoir are to the north. On a clear day, you can see Denver and even Kansas. The red rocks of the Garden of the Gods decorate the eastern view, and downtown Colorado Springs towers above the plains. A stone wall of the original Summit House remains. The new Summit House opened in 1964. Like the new Summit House, the old facility sold gifts and refreshments. It was originally built in 1882 as a weather station by the U.S. Army Signal Service. The weather station closed, and the newly remodeled building included a tourist hotel for 15 guests. Before 1900, a steel tower was built above the hotel rooms on the north end of the building. An additional charge allowed the tourists to climb even higher. Not as silly as it may seem, the view to the west especially was improved by gaining elevation over the wide, flat summit. The choir of Denver's Highlands Christian Church was first to reach the summit on June 30th, 1891. Since then, the summit has hosted every imaginable activity. In the pleasant fall weather of 1912, the Colorado Midland Railway Band entertained on the summit. However, our time on the summit is over, and we must begin our return. In September of 1889, grading began at the summit. A 4-foot November snow ended work above timberline. Pay was 18 cents an hour for grueling high-altitude labor without animals or machinery. Track laying started at the bottom in June 1890 and was completed by October 20th. The first passenger train reached the summit on June 30th, 1891. Snow is a continuing battle for the railroad. Snow can fall any time of the year on Pike's Peak, but clearing the track in the spring is most difficult. From the earliest days, snow was removed by pushing a flat car plow into the drifts. The plow is backed away and men shoveled the snow off the car, a grueling job at these high altitudes. By 1973, snow removal still had not changed much. A diesel locomotive now pushed the flat car plow into the snow and backed away with tons of white powder, while men still suffered the task of shoveling that snow off. A hydraulic lift was added to dump snow off the flat car. The railroad built a rotary snowplow in 1952. The machine was not completely successful, and the old plowing method remained. No matter what the plow, very deep snow must be blasted down to a height within the plow's capacity. Explosives are tamped into a snow hole and detonated. By 1974, a new rotary plow built by American Snowblast had finally retired the flat car. The new plow resembles and works like a giant snowblower. Yet hand shovelers must still clear away ice frozen to the track. Like all gears, the rack rail must be lubricated. In early years, an employee applied lubricant to each tooth with a brush. The lubricant hardened every few hundred yards, and a fire was built to soften it. It took a month to traverse the railroad. Now, automatic lubricators are on the trains. With all these rocks around, one occasionally falls on the track. Explosives are placed, and the many-ton rock is blasted into pieces that can be removed easily. That boulder was made of Pike's Peak granite, unique to this mountain. It is pinkish, soft, and prone to weathering. In 1938, swing was king, and the Manitou and Pikes Peak Railway built its first streamliner. Not only was this car faster than the steamers, but it reduced maintenance and operating costs. Car 7 carried 24 passengers and still exists. Car 7 was so successful that 5 diesel-electric streamlined trains were eventually built. These trains consisted of a locomotive and a coach carrying 52 passengers. Some of these locomotives still operate, mostly on work trains. One streamlined coach was restored by the railroad and still sees occasional service on special passenger trains. In 1963, the first of 4 Swiss-built rail cars was delivered. Each carries 80 passengers and still sees service when smaller trains are needed. These cars are diesel-electric, powered by Cummins diesels. These 80-passenger trains were built by the Swiss Locomotive and Machine Works. Like the newer 216-passenger twin units, they were tested in Switzerland. The shops of the Swiss Locomotive and Machine Works are in Winterthur, Switzerland. Here is the first twin-unit train prior to testing. Only half of the train was tested on the Arth-Regibahn, a cog railroad in Switzerland. Extensive testing included engineering analysis of data gathered from instruments on the train. The Manitou and Pikes Peak train meets 2 Arth-Regibahn trains. Mount Rigi is the only peak served by 2 cog railways. The second track is the Witznau-Regibahn. In 1976, the first twin-unit trains were delivered. These weigh 73 tons and are 124 feet long. Inspired by an 1893 carriage trip to the summit, Catherine Lee Bates wrote the words to the song we know as America the Beautiful. Railroad employees maintain equipment during the winter. Here an engine is removed to overhaul its transmission. These engines are made by Cummins in the United States. Once the engine has been removed, the rails are replaced and the train moved away. With the train gone, the rails are again removed to allow the engine to be lifted. The transmission, made by Twin Disc in the United States, is removed for later overhaul and replaced with a previously rebuilt transmission. No job is small, and even the flywheel must be removed with a hoist. The Pikes Peak Power Company's generating plant once hummed below Son of a Gun Hill. Engelman Canyon was named for George Engelman, a 19th century English botanist who explored this area. The last operating steam locomotive waits to welcome our train. Steam locomotives provided the power for the Manitou and Pikes Peak Railway for many years. 7 steamers were built for the railway. Cog locomotives are different from ordinary steam locomotives, requiring special rods to transfer power to the cog wheel. Manitou and Pikes Peak locomotives were small, around 25 to 30 tons. Locomotive 4 powered the last steam passenger trip in 1958, and no one expected to see steam again. But that locomotive was retrieved from a museum, restored, and ran again in 1980. This locomotive was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia in 1897.
on behalf of your engineer Jim and myself, I would like to thank all of you for riding aboard the Manitoulin Pikes Peak Railway this afternoon. I hope you had a memorable trip.
Memorable indeed. As our train arrives at the depot, we have climbed to the top of 14,000-foot Pikes Peak and returned. Exhilarated travelers now return to life at lower elevations.
You can't go back. You can't recapture those simpler, quieter, more gracious times of the past. Everyone will tell you that. Well, everyone's wrong. Just 70 miles west of the hustle and bustle of Denver exists a time machine. Unlike H.G. Wells' time machine, this one's real. You can go back. You can ride a time machine. You can ride the Georgetown Loop Railroad. Mist still hangs low in the valley as number 40 is fired up. All steam engines used on the Georgetown Loop Railroad are oil burners. The firing up process is a carefully orchestrated symphony of sound and movement, as complicated as any ballet, though much noisier. Steam locomotives are perhaps the ultimate mechanical device. This locomotive and its stablemate, number 44, both pulled trains on the International Railway of Central America. They were located in El Salvador and made much of the trip to the United States border under their own steam power, not without incident, however. Number 40 was purchased in 1968, but political unrest kept the engine in El Salvador until 1972. Today, number 40 will pull several hundred passengers on the 4.5-mile trip. By the short season's close, the Georgetown Loop Railroad will carry nearly 100,000 passengers, train lovers, thrill seekers, or just plain tourists. No special reasons are needed to ride a train like this.
We should be leaving here momentarily, so enjoy your ride on the Georgetown Loop Railroad.
Let's fuel up the engine for a run. A steam-powered pump on the right is hooked up to a steam line on the engine and pumps oil from the tanker on the left to fuel the engine to make the steam which pumps the oil. Sort of perpetual motion. And the result? Well, come on, let's take a ride.
The locomotive has spent the night at Silver Plume, and it will hurry down to Georgetown. The train moves through the golden aspen and cool days of autumn, passing the Hall Tunnel, site of a mine. Mining caused this railroad to be built. We finally reach the Georgetown platform and can begin our trip. We back down under the high bridge, so we can say we have made the complete circle of the loop, traveling over ourselves. Our train crosses Clear Creek for the first of 4 times. Rounding a curve, the locomotive eases out into Devil's Gate Viaduct, 300 feet long, 100 high, and the second crossing of Clear Creek. Here we cross over where we started minutes ago.
One day in 1859, George Griffith rested by a big beaver pond and stumbled on the only spot where gold was found in this valley. The town that grew from this single incident of golden success was unlike most mining camps of the day. From the very first, Georgetown seemed to be a gentler, more refined, more polished place to live than the typical mining camp. Homes reflected an elegance that was mirrored in the fine architectural details of the commercial buildings. Pride in community was exemplified by the flashy, uniformed volunteer fire department. Georgetown never was destroyed by a fire, a tribute perhaps to these hardy men. Georgetown could boast of one of the finest hotels anywhere, the Hotel de Paris. The food and wines were unmatched, as were the accommodations. A hotel fit for royalty. Yes, Georgetown was not your usual mining camp. Silver, not gold, made Georgetown. There were rich veins of silver on both steep sides of the canyon walls that squeezed the town. Finding the silver was only one of the problems faced by the prospectors. The ore had to be transported to market. Steep mountain grades and poor roads proved difficult in the ascent and dangerous in the descent for oxen or mule-powered wagons. A railroad was the only answer. Mountain railroads are different from railroads found on the plains. The steeper grades and tighter curves necessitated smaller equipment running on rails only 3 feet apart, hence the name narrow gauge. But even for narrow gauge, some areas seemed impossible to conquer. The 2 1/10 miles from Georgetown to Silver Plume seemed just such an area. Silver Plume is 638 feet above Georgetown, and the straight line climb was not possible. The narrow canyon complicated the problem. The solution, called the Devil's Gate Viaduct, later the Georgetown Loop, was a high iron bridge rising almost 100 feet above Clear Creek, crossing over itself with a span of almost 300 feet. It was an amazing feat of engineering. Surveyed in 1879, construction began in 1881 and was completed in 1884. Noted Colorado newscaster Carl Akers put it best. Of all the absurd places that rails went in the mountains, they said this was the absurdest, and they were right. In order to traverse the 2 1/10 miles between the two camps, the engineer Jacob Blickensderfer had the tracks cross over themselves to go through a hairpin turn and a horseshoe curve, all the while climbing up the canyon. It took nearly 4 1/2 miles to go the 2-mile straight line distance. At last, ore mined in the canyon could reach the market. The boom lasted a scant 9 years. The repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act brought a decline of silver prices that finally closed most of the mines. But all was not lost. Tourists had discovered the loop. The trip from Denver to Georgetown was an easy one-day excursion. The scenery was spectacular, and of course there was nothing like the Devil's Gate Viaduct anywhere. Tourists soon replaced ore as the paying load. This rare motion picture footage shows a tourist train going over the Devil's Gate Viaduct in 1904. This is one of the earliest known examples of a motion picture camera placed on a moving platform. It is also the only known motion picture footage of the original loop. Tourists haven't changed much. Notice this rare view of a second train crossing the Devil's Gate Viaduct. This view of Georgetown is an invaluable aid to historians. Tourism became Georgetown's and Silver Plume's sustaining industry. A vast array of souvenirs attest to the worldwide acclaim of the Georgetown Loop. Postcards by the thousands. But there were other, more elegant keepsakes to take home. This magnificent sterling silver spoon, circa 1910, is engraved with the image of the loop in its bowl. One side of the engraved handle depicts a miner in the state seal of Colorado, and the other side is a bucking horse and covered wagon. This exquisite souvenir teacup, made in Germany around the turn of the century, demonstrates the international scope of the loop.
No one expected to ride the train to Georgetown through the cool, clear air of autumn, or to again hear the sounds of steam engines echo off the canyon walls. No one except a few railroad enthusiasts and some far-sighted members of the Colorado Historical Society. When an interstate highway was to be built through the site of the loop, the Colorado Historical Society fought to have that highway relocated high on the canyon wall. Without that effort, the Georgetown Loop could never have been rebuilt.
The Georgetown area had retained much of its charm and identity from its Silver Camp days. In 1966, both Silver Plume and Georgetown were designated as National Historic Areas. The Colorado Historical Society realized that a mining and railroad park would complete the area's heritage. The town has several museums, such as the famous Hotel de Paris and the restored Hamel House.
But before we start the story of the loop's reconstruction, let's return to our trip and enjoy more of Colorado's scenery. Our train approaches the Hall Tunnel, a mining tunnel. Here rest stored railroad cars and antique mining machinery of another era. Passengers glimpse the Lebanon Mine, where visitors can walk into the side of a mountain. Our train crosses Clear Creek for the third time, this time over Turntable Bridge. Coming out of a cut, Clear Creek is bridged for the fourth and final time. A firm with experience in running tourist railways petitioned the Historical Society to operate a railroad over the old right-of-way and was awarded a 30-year lease to do so.
The Union Pacific, who once owned the loop, was very supportive. They donated 2.5 miles of rail if volunteers would dig it up. And then one of those minor miracles happened. It seems that the local U.S. Navy Reserve Mobile Construction Battalion, the Seabees, had gone a long time without building a railroad. Since a rail line is essential in time of war, they offered their services to build the trackage. The Pin Truss Bridge was found on an abandoned portion of the Colorado and Southern lines. Photos show that it is almost identical to the original one used. Some official decreed that the bridge had to be transported intact. This did present a few problems. Eventually, they had to take it apart anyway. Ties and rails were laid from this bridge towards Silver Plume to the west. The first train over the bridge was this newly arrived narrow-gauge diesel. Purists were upset that the first wasn't a steam engine until they realized that if the bridge had failed for some reason, it would be better to dump a diesel engine into the drink than a steamer. Apologies to any diesel fans in the audience. With trackage ready, the number 40 was loaded up in Central City. Following the route of its Colorado and Southern predecessors, the engine made its way up Clear Creek towards Georgetown. The original Silver Plume Depot was moved into place by the Seabees. These fellows played an immeasurable part in the construction of the line. Many of them became so caught up in the project, they worked even on weekends when the battalion was not active. Once in Silver Plume, the Seabees added their personal touch.
Equipment for the line was collected from all over Colorado and many other places.
In August of 1974, steam returned to the canyon after 4 decades. East of the Pin Truss Bridge, the pilings for the next crossing had stood quietly since the abandonment. With some detective work and a lot of luck, the original bridge was found near Denver. The bridge was actually designed to be a turntable on a standard gauge railroad, but the engineers who laid out the original line were delighted to find that it was the right length to span the river. As with all of the projects, great care was taken to ensure historical accuracy. The first train over the turntable bridge ran in 1975. It was, of course, the diesel. The diesel was built in 1943 by General Electric for the Oahu Railway in Hawaii. Over the years, number 15 has proven its worth to the railroad. During the bicentennial celebration of 1976, nearly every railroad in the country painted some of its equipment for the occasion. Steam-powered trains were soon hauling tourists over the turntable bridge. When the trains reached this point down the valley, it allowed the Colorado Historical Society to open another phase of this outdoor museum. Guides escort visitors into the depths of the Lebanon silver mine for a glimpse of what it was like. The Seabees also helped restore the outbuildings to complete the mine complex museum. New projects, such as additional sidings to display equipment, as well as general maintenance, kept the railroad busy. But it seemed as if the railroad was destined to go no further. The next step would be to rebuild the high bridge. All that remained were the abutments. Conservative estimates put the cost at $1 million. Yet another miracle. Denver's Betcher Foundation offered a grant for $1 million to rebuild the high bridge. Following that were grants of $400,000 from the Gates Foundation and $200,000 from the Atlantic Richfield Foundation. The loop would indeed be rebuilt. Construction began in June of 1983. When the original bridge was built, the railroad had a difficult time obtaining enough help. In spite of high wages, men would take the free train ride from Denver, take one look at the bridge, and slip off to get a much safer job in the mines. As each span was eased into place, at least one official would ride up with it on the crane. If you look carefully, you can still see some of the officials' fingerprints embedded in the steel where they had a grip. In an interesting case of completing the circle, the center span took a ride on the rails itself before assuming its new job of supporting rails. The structure was completed on September 25, 1983. But Colorado's weather took over. Rails were not laid until the following spring. The first train across the bridge was pushed by the diesel. Quietly and with no fanfare or cameras around, on the night of May 30th, 1984. The diesel pushed this flat car loaded down with rock for ballast across First. Finally, at 7:58 a.m. on June 1st, Shea engines number 8 and number 14 backed down from Silver Plume and eased confidently onto the bridge. The number 8 whistled, and the number 14 answered in triumph, announcing that the time machine had been completed. The echoes reverberated down the canyon and through time itself. Steam had returned to the Devil's Gate Viaduct. As you probably noticed as it crossed the high bridge, Shays are different. If steam locomotives are indeed the ultimate mechanical devices, then Shays are the ultimate steam locomotives. Shays transfer power to the wheels through a series of helically cut gears and universals. This makes the engines less stiff and more powerful, but slower. Shays can climb steeper grades and negotiate sharper curves. The Georgetown Loop Railroad has 3 of these unique locomotives. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when a plate girder bridge was found in Nebraska and transported to Colorado. The loop was completed by spanning Clear Creek for the 4th time.
The Morrison Foundation donated the funds to build a visitor center at the Georgetown end of the railroad.
Silver Plume hasn't been forgotten during all this time. A new engine facility has been completed, which allows maintenance of the locomotives during the long winter months.
Let's climb up the Big Fill and finish our trip to Silver Plume. From the Big Fill, you can clearly see the Devil's Gate Viaduct and Georgetown in the distance.
Lindsay Ashby shares with us what the future holds for the Georgetown Loop Railroad.
Oh, there always has to be something in the future, and there's talk right now in Silver Plume about the Argentine Central, which would run maybe 12 miles up to the old ghost town of Waldorf and on to Mount McClellan, just a hair under 14,000 feet.
With the Colorado Railroad Museum, the Cumbres and Toltec, the Durango and Silverton, and of course the Georgetown Loop, narrow gauge railroading hasn't been this popular in Colorado since that first gold strike in 1859.
Come on, ride a time machine. Ride the Georgetown Loop Railroad.